All right, here we go. All right, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome down the security rabbit hole to another edition of cybersecurity's favorite podcast, the Down the Security Rabbit Hole podcast. This is Raf. Here I am. And there's Jim, there's James, multiple returning guests. I need to make t shirts for this. Will, how are you, buddy?
I'm good. Yeah, at least a coffee mug maybe or a button, like the old school campaign buttons, three times
That's
on
right.
on down the rabbit, down the security rabbit hole. I'm good. Yeah, I'm good. How are you guys doing?
I can't complain, man. It's that time here in Georgia where we have like 75 to 82 during the day and like 60 to 65 at night. It's like perfect sleeping weather. It's amazing.
Yeah, that's beautiful, man. That's really nice.
It's
And
yeah.
I hope you guys
Mornings
are
are brisk,
enjoying
but
all that. Yeah,
oh
yeah.
yeah. Very much so enjoying it. Very much so enjoying it. I'm going to enjoy the contents of this one. I feel like we're on a bit of an AI adjacent tear, right? We're talking about
Mm.
all things related to this new technology AI. And on this podcast, I wanted to dive into what that actually means for your old trade, and that
Mm.
is the intelligence game, picking up, analyzing, disseminating, and making sense of the signal out there that bad guys leave behind. And so that's where I want to start. Actually, we should probably start with what are you doing now, Will?
Oh, what am I doing now? I'm sitting in Texas. Yeah, no, I about a year ago, I co-founded a new cybersecurity startup called Salient Cyber, and we're focused on addressing the impact of artificial intelligence on the threat landscape as it relates to traditional threats that have been largely speaking unmet by reactive technologies, uh, and those threats which have been enhanced or weaponized as a result of the advent of artificial intelligence, in addition to those threats which are native to AI that folks are going to have to contend with, and in addition to those things which are generated from and as a result of artificial intelligence, irrespective of its flavoring. So that's what we've been focused on. It's a really forward-thinking approach to prevention. A shift left value proposition that we're really excited about and we're getting a lot of traction with. So that's what I've been up to for the last year. And of course, there's an intelligence aspect of that.
That's super exciting. So when we think about uh, traditionally, maybe we should frame this for folks that aren't familiar with this and haven't lived in this same world that you come from. When we say threat intelligence, right? There used to be a large blowback to this for a long time, where it was like it's not
Yeah,
intelligence unless you do something with it. Unless it's actionable. It's just usually threat data that you're collecting. But there were a
yeah,
lot of threat intel companies for a hot minute. Like everybody started a threat intel company. Um,
yeah.
Talk to me about where that started and kind of how it's been evolving.
Wow, where it started historically,
I mean, I don't.
in
We
the
don't need to. We don't need to
yeah,
go back to like
and
back into
like
caveman. But
like commercially, I'd say if some people may differ in their opinion on this, but commercially, when I think back about the first original commercial entity that focused explicitly on cyber threat intelligence, or even like before cyber was a key word, right? Information security, threat intelligence. There was a company called Cyvalence, and I don't know if you guys know Eric Olson. One of these days, I'll have to. Yeah, um, if I'm not mistaken, Cyvalence was the first commercial threat intelligence organization, and that's an important distinguishing factor, right? Commercial. Naturally, there were all sorts of things that were adjacent to the Department of Defense and to the intelligence company within respect to the defense industrial base that were doing a lot of things in and around threat intelligence as the internet became the internet that we know and love, kind of post in 1995 and before that as well, right? All the variants. But I think as far as commercial activity, I think the surveillance guys were the first guys on the scene. And of course later on, as more and more information security companies and then cybersecurity product companies and vendors came online too, including the MSSPs, naturally they would be customers and consumers of the data, and the other respective intelligence work products that guys like Cyvalence were producing. And then that led to kind of like what I would consider to be like the first wave in the early 2000s of pure or play threat intelligence organizations, and they were a lot of them very specialized by virtue of threat type, right? And then I'd say probably somewhere around the 2006 2006, 2007, 2008 timeframe, there started to be much more of a congealing of real effort and energy around outside of the big antivirus firms and outside of the big cybersecurity companies that were out. There was much more of an intent to try to build and dominate that trade craft from a top down and a bottom up perspective within the confines of unique businesses like you're talking about. And then you started to see a lot of organizations come on the scene. You started to see big and small ones. You started to see guys like Eyesight Partners emerge, and naturally speaking, there were guys like Cassandra Security, and there were the guys like all the various and sundry vulnerability intelligence guys. Like the guys who ultimately went iDefense, who became like part of VeriSign, and a whole host of folks. And then of course, it's like it's on an ontological view, it's a spidering effect, because those people leave and they go to new places and seed out and build out that foundation. So it's had a lot of maturity. It's had a lot of time to mature, and it's had a lot of opportunity to consolidate. And certainly, it's also seen outside of the independents. There have been various eras, I think, of well thought out and well crafted. I would call them internally driven threat intelligence organizations within bigger quote unquote intelligence driven ecosystems. So you had like when Mandiant bought Unvalence, like Kareem Hijazi's company. That was a huge thing when and I was trying to acquire Unvalence at the same time when I was at Tipping Point, and Kevin got them. And as a result of Kevin and those guys getting them, not too long thereafter, and Kareem would tell you this himself, and there were other people who were there, APT1 became a thing, because they all of a sudden had an intelligence fusion center within the belly of this beast at Mandiant. And of course we were doing that stuff at NetWitness, in the same time period. And then there were other folks. CrowdStrike, of course, was coming online, doing things like that. And the HB Gary, at the time, were doing their thing. There was a lot of that. And at the time, and for a long time, it was I would call it kind of like a more idiosyncratic, perhaps less known, but very highly sought after aspect of the business. Certainly very cool for marketing people and PR to have access to those kinds of folks, but a lot of organizations didn't really know how to make money from it. If you were inside a bigger product company or services company, it wasn't easily skewable. But of course, then it became more popularized, right? And then over time, like everything else, you started seeing larger and larger ecosystems emerge, like Unit 42, the guys that reported future, so on, and all the OSINT guys like Digital Shadows, which I was a part of for a while, years ago. And that cycle kind of continues, and you see this ebb and flow, this expansion and contraction, oftentimes with a lot of the same faces, kind of maturing and matriculating into higher positions of authority in those companies. Yeah.
You say dilution of that though, because a lot of people think threat intelligence, they just think of like news feeds. Like all the vendors now, right? Everybody, it doesn't matter whether you're in threat intel company or not. Oh, we have a threat intel feed. And it's usually, just links to common news stories out there of things going on versus like in-depth analysis.
Yeah. I mean, I think that, it's a good question. I think historically, people have been a little cavalier and liberal with the terminology, where there used to be a lot of, and I would argue there probably still is from a purist point of view, a lot of debate about threat intelligence would very much so arrive on points like you just described, James, where people say a lot of them are just kind of recycling or collecting like news feeds and kind of delivering that as though it were an intelligence work product. It's not. It's information. But all intelligence work products start out as some form of information, and then it goes through a synthesis and a life cycle to get to become an intelligence work product. It gets vetted, just like the software development life cycle has a life cycle. There's an intelligence life cycle as well. So news stories in and of themselves are not intelligence, but they can be certainly used as a part of an intelligence, life cycle, and certainly in the course of generating intelligence work products. But I think that's a good way to kind of, begin the conversation, is to distinguish and delineate, hey, what is and what isn't threat intelligence, and why is that important? Yeah, open source, right, which is very much now these days almost like I would say like a commoditized terminology, right, in terms of its being ubiquitous. Very much so capitalizes off of open sources, and news feeds are very good, examples of that, right? Certainly not the only thing that you want to be cognizant of, but it's good to add context and color and to kind of test, theses against. But threat intelligence is a lot more than that.
Yeah. I think just, so many places, right? Like your tool says it's got a threat intel feed. If you're checking off audit and compliance, and you're like, oh, well, are you guys doing threat intelligence? Like, yep. I got a feed coming in every day. I look at the news stories. We're good. We got threat intel, right? Even though there's no process behind the story that came in internally where you're saying, what did I do with this information outside of maybe I looked at it and saw, oh, it says SQL Server. We use SQL Server. Let's take a look at that. Like keying off the key terms.
Yeah.
I'm not doing like the true intel that's happening behind the story, to really see what's going on.
Yeah, I would argue that those types of sources are, I mean, there's room for a lot of things at this respective and collective table that we refer to as cyber threat intelligence, right? And like I said, I think news feeds play a role in that, but that's not a principal intelligence work product. I mean, I come from a line of thinking, for lack of a better term, or turn of phrase, that would suggest and argue that threat intelligence work is really just a distillation and a derivative of intelligence work and intelligence tradecraft, which means it's a discipline, which may or may not be a universally held belief in our industry. When I say it's a discipline, I mean that it has all the rigor and it has all the requirements and it has all of the integrity-driven aspects and outcomes that you should have if you're conducting the work appropriately and you're concerned about the outcomes and the application of the intelligence work product in the course of someone's day-to-day or someone's mission, right? In the end, that's what's most important. Why are you producing what you're producing, and is it to help advance someone's mission? Whether that mission is part of the Department of Defense or Department of War, right, that we're using today, right, or whether it's in a commercial application. If it's not going to advance someone's mission in terms of defense or in keeping people safe or assets safe or ultimately retaining and maintaining and retaining a competitive advantage, irrespective of what feeder we're talking about, then it's going to be of a lot less importance, especially for the consumer. So I think if people treat it like it's just an auditable, I have a threat intelligence feed, check the box and let's move forward, they're probably doing themselves a disservice, and certainly encouraging, perhaps, continued mediocrity from certain vendors. I'm not going to say all vendors operate that way because they don't. But I would argue that if that's the bar that people are setting, consumers set that bar to some extent or another. Right? We all have the ability to vote with our feet, as my father used to say. So, well, we don't have to accept those types of sources, and we don't have to endorse that as a long-standing tried and true ubiquitous foundational outcome to threat intelligence programs within the context of a cybersecurity program. That's a lot on that. But.
Go ahead, Jim.
I was going to say I think I'm just going to say eloquently, very eloquently, sort of articulated some of the dynamics between, say, a federal agency type of level intelligence and versus the public sector type of intelligence, or private sector, sorry. And I want to ask you a question and I think, and I'm with James on this one, I think it's been diluted dramatically into news feeds. I mean, dramatically. And I think it's a combination. I want to get your opinion on this. A combination of the lack of understanding what to actually do with real threat intelligence. Like some people think a news feed is threat intelligence, and it's not. Sure. And clearly, to your statement, it's not the case. But then when they do get exposed to enriched intelligence concerning cyber threats, it in some cases I feel like it's a little bit, I didn't want to know that. I'm not going to ask you. You know what I mean? I can't deal with it. So is it a situation of the lack of capability in intelligence environments, or they're responding to the fact that people are, voting with their wallet and buying stuff that is easy button, and we just sort of in that trough of trying to figure out what's right in the private sector?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of things, right? I mean, I think that number one, it's always an education, like with any type of commercial endeavor, right? If you're working for a pure play cyber threat intelligence organization, and there's some fantastic ones out there, or if you're part of a team within a bigger cybersecurity organization that's driving the intelligence, and dare I say even the intelligence that drives the detection, if you will, engineering, efforts, you have a responsibility to your internal peers, your internal customers, as well as your actual consumers, to educate them and enable them to understand the nature of your product and, ultimately speaking, the application of that product. In addition to, very much so, I think, the bona fides and the deficiencies associated with it. So, and I'll expand on that in a second. So I think part of the issue is that we're inundated with data, and we're inundated with a lot of information. And I think intelligence work products ought to be held to a much higher standard internally when you're producing them, and then certainly when you're bringing them to market. That's not to say that everybody holds to that same ideal. And I think to your point, a lot of people look at, cyber threat intelligence or maybe even cybersecurity news, and they misconstrue or they maybe conflate the two. Oh, this news has to be related to cyber threat intelligence because it's referring to a threat actor or a campaign or some sort of event. Maybe it's a vulnerability exploitation. And in some cases, there may be very much so a lot of truth to that statement. In other cases, it may be very high level. It may be driven by, op-ed stylized, journalism, or whatever the case may be, an agenda of some sort of bias. So I think there is, part of the problem is that I think that because the industry has kind of done two things with threat intelligence, they've managed to make something which is, and I always use the analogy especially at my last shop when I was at NetWin, is that it's the fuel that drives the engine, right? If the product is the engine and it wants to take you where you want to go, you need a high octane fuel to get there, right? For example, I would say I can build you a rocket. I can build you a rocket that'll take you to Mars, but I need the right type of fuel to get you there, right? I can't use commoditized fuel to get you there. So the importance of the threat intelligence work products, whether they're feeds or whether they're API driven sources or whether they're bespoke or well-crafted reports or all points in between, and there are a lot of different kinds of products we can talk about, is really rooted in the fidelity, the integrity, and ultimately speaking, I think the competence behind the generation and that leads to quality, right? And then also being able to help people understand and this is where it gets to your second question, understand the applicability or not to their respective scenarios, right? So, I think sometimes what happens is people will look at news feeds and they'll say, oh my gosh, this has global applicability to all people. Pick your poison, vulnerability exploitation driven by new and express forms of tooling or threat actor activity, whatever the case may be, not necessarily considering the fact that, not in all cases, but in some cases that, hey, how likely is this to impact our environment? What's the probability versus possibility? And ultimately, what has to align for these things to happen, right? Outside of certain, areas where I think there are certainly kind of universal, points of concern, like with phishing attacks, still at the highest level of intrusion-driven events like phishing. It's just crazy to me. Spear phishing and phishing. But when you look at that, right, I think it comes down to education, right? So I think there's an opportunity, and maybe there's an opportunity to kind of see a renaissance in threat intelligence, independently or within the context and the confines of a business, a cybersecurity business, that aids people in really understanding that applicability, right? So that it removes the fear, uncertainty, and doubt. Because I think sometimes, even though I like to think that most people have really good intentions when they're going to market with things, it's not always the case. And I think sometimes messaging can drive, the emotional qualities in people, right? And certainly play with people's emotions, even subconsciously, right? That leads them to a conclusion they might not otherwise arrive at if they were having a more academically driven conversation, right? So that's important, right? It's opportunity. Yeah.
Yeah, let me drive us towards. Let me take us to sort of the next thing I want to talk about, which is kind of the changes, right?
Yeah.
Over the last 20 years, you've highlighted some of them, but in terms of technology and maybe we can't. I don't think we can get too deep into law because there's.
I'm not a lawyer, so don't ask me.
Yeah, none of us are lawyers.
Question.
We probably should have that discussion at some point soon too. But from a technology perspective, right? Intelligence gathering used to be a largely manual process. People would
Mm-hmm.
the way I understand it, I mean, people would go out and gather. They would pose as they would create alternate identities. They would go sit in dark rooms and troll forums and all these things, right? Together,
Yeah.
and going all the way back to like true military and government applications of intelligence.
Yeah.
How
it goes back all the way to the
changing?
Sumerians.
Right, all the way back. How do
Yeah.
you think that's changed over, let's say, the last 20 years? Because I just realized as you were saying 2008, I was like, yeah, that was just almost
Feels like yesterday. Yeah.
yeah.
It's changed a lot,
That's a long time ago.
yeah, it's changed a lot, right? There is certainly still, I think, a lot of value in having the ability to drive what conventionally in the applied world of intelligence, when you think about things in Department of War or intelligence community parlance, would be colloquially referred to as human stylized intelligence, or derivations thereof, right? So persona-driven campaigns, sock puppet campaigns, right? In their world, they're actually going out and they're doing physical meat space type of interactions from a human point of view. Cyber tends to not do that, although I wouldn't say that that's entirely exclusive. I know that the guys, like for example, at Eyesight Partners used to have folks in country, like 19 or 20 countries years and years ago, right? They would hire former law enforcement folks and a number of other professionals that had the ability to kind of have those physical connections, if you will. Other forms of intelligence gathering, to your point, remote and otherwise, persona-driven sock puppet campaigns, forum scraping. I think there's still room for having an educated eye in that. It'll probably change as a result of some of the tooling I know you want to talk about. But overall, right, we've seen kind of echelons of technology and waves of technology come in the last 20 years that have really made a lot of this from a collections perspective a lot easier. Big data certainly being an advent that was useful for a lot of us. Disparate forms of collection ecosystems out in the wilds of the internet, honey netting, honey potting, certainly things like tar pitting, and a whole host of other things, sinkholing, right? For example, from a DNS point of view, which has made life easier. But being able to go through the process of collections and ingestion and then sanitizing that information was always laborious, even with like earlier echelons and applications of machine learning, for lack of a better term. If you could automate it and you could still apply modeling to it, it was still hard. It was still a fairly consuming process in the truest sense of all of that word and all of its applications. And we've seen kind of fits and throws of that, and we've even seen prior I would say applications of first wave of bot technology within the spans of intelligence organizations, where people were standing up chatbots and doing all kinds of things before the rise of generative AI and LLMs to kind of amplify and accelerate, and expedite the ability to interact with those large corpuses of data that ideally would have been well curated, but certainly still took a lot of time and energy from a human point of view to collect, and also to validate and verify and deduplicate, and even with the advent of some of these tools we were talking about, to ensure that there was a degree of purity, right? So it has changed, and it will continue to change. And I think, I know you wanted to talk about AI and probably the more contemporary flavors of it within the spans of that. And I think there's room for a lot of sound application there, but I think there's also, like anything else related to artificial intelligence, there has to be more than a modicum of caution, as well as just reality checking when it comes to what the tooling can and can't do, and what it does and it does not afford you to realize as far as outcomes are concerned, predicated on the fact that it's of how it's trained and what it's being trained against, right? So you guys know as well as I do, right, that if you're training against the internet, you're training against the internet, right?
Yeah.
If you have if you've got really well curated and pristine data sets to train against, and you're doing it in an enclave, you'll have a different outcome than you would if you were just training against the open internet, right? But the reality of remaining in that highly hygienic enclave ad infinitum is probably pretty remote, right? At some point, somebody's going to start crossing the proverbial streams, and the internet will bleed in one way or another, right? Because they want different skill sets, or they want different, exposure to different types of disciplines, so on and so forth.
I can think of at least two ways that I think AI could be useful here, both from a gathering perspective, right? Going out and doing some of the bots have gotten relatively good at impersonating humans, which is scary as hell, but here we are. And so I think going and the thing that humans like our limitation was there's only so much information we can read and process, so many web pages, so many chat logs, so many postings that we can digest at a time. Bots can do that way faster.
They've been able to do that for a long time. Yeah, even before the generative AI angle came out. Yeah.
Right. And then now I think with AI, like with the AI advancements, we'll say specific to what I think generative AI has the ability to do, I think perhaps, and maybe I'm a little too far ahead of technology, but the ability to tell what's usable versus what's just noise, or what's just data, right? Because there's data, there's intelligence, and then so that's on the gathering side, but on the usability side, I imagine that there's a pretty large, like just like with when we talked about SOAR and automation, We've had Phil Humo on here a couple times from CrowdSec about how like the best kind of intel is the kind that's immediately actionable, not the kind you have to go think about or distill it further yourself. So does AI then create or I don't know enable or somehow buffer that middle distillation that critical analysis? Is this relevant to me? What should I do with this layer for us?
Yeah.
Is that a possibility?
I think it is, right. I think you brought up a good point, and I would agree with it because I've seen it firsthand. You can accelerate a lot of activity. I wouldn't say that it's a replacement for a human, especially a highly skilled human being, but you can certainly accelerate the work of of multiple highly skilled human beings. And in fact, I'm a big advocate of this as a use case. You know, in the right hands, with under the right guidance and guardrails, for lack of a better term, highly skilled intelligence analysts, kind of irrespective of their area of discipline, can create force multipliers in the same way that a developer can with this technology. That doesn't mean the human is out of the loop. Largely speaking, because they never should be, right? Just like if you're writing code, you can do a lot of things to advance coding and development. You still want to look at your code, right? You still want to run it through eyeball QA as well as automated QA. And the same is true for, I think, intelligence, what becomes, ultimately speaking, the foundational aspects of intelligence work products. So if we're talking about being able to identify and qualify, information sources, data repositories, could be even, could be persona, information, whatever the data type is, and quickly ascertain whether or not, number one, it's been seen before. Two, whether or not it's viable. Three, whether or not it has a gross applicability today. Four, whether there's something new and novel in it, and being able to kind of take that and understand that quickly. And then compare that against your pre-existing corpus, and then run through actions related to deduplication, refresh, all those wonderful things, and then to utilize that in a very highly effective automated fashion to bolster personas, for example, and then thusly the highly actionable, until you were referring to earlier. I think it can help exercise a lot of things in that aspect of the intelligence lifecycle. What I don't think it can do, and I don't think it will ever be able to do, is really replace the role of a human in the total fabric of intelligence work product generation, because of the nature of how we think and the way in which we diverge in our thinking. And that's an important, I think, and it's very important, I think, and it's really kind of a key thing to note, right? So yeah, it has a lot of gross applications that I think can create exquisite force multiplication factors for the right types of organizations and for the right types of leadership. And I think it can aid in taking maybe even mediocre offerings and enhancing them and making them better. The caveat being, though, with all intelligence work products, is it boils down to the uniqueness of the data. So if everyone's using commoditized data pools, right? It's kind of like the gene pool, right? If everyone's got, like, if we're all pulling from the same pool, right? And we're all more or less going to the same sources, right? And we may be enriching and enhancing, or maybe representing it a little different, but over time, right, the uniqueness of that pool really, erodes, right? And then, if you're not looking for net new unique sources, everyone's going to arrive at the same conclusions, right? And we've seen this, all of us have seen this. I think AI could help in identifying net new novel sources, but again, I go back to, I don't think it will be one of these technologies that replaces the human in this aspect of cybersecurity. Just like I don't think it will replace humans in a lot of other areas of our world and our life, because the AI is not going to know that, hey, I know Jim Tiller. Jim Tiller has been collecting and curating a very unique form of intelligence that isn't public, right, for decades. Hypothetically, Jim, not trying to put you on the spot here, right? And I know this because I know Jim, and I've built a relationship with Jim, right? And I can get access to that data, and I can get access to that data in an anonymized fashion under the auspices of contracts, and do all kinds of things that gives me a competitive edge that isn't publicly available to people. So unless somebody compromises me or Jim, they first off, they'd have to know about Jim existing, right? AI is not going to necessarily know about Jim existing in that context if Jim is being good with his OPSEC, right? So the whole point of my little narrative there, right, my vignette, is that there's a lot of things that we'll be able to help with respect to accelerating intelligence collections, deduplication, refreshing, the distillation, as well as the creation of artifacts, reports, profiles, dossiers, things of that nature. but that's only going to work really, again, under the watchful eye of smart, well experienced human beings. I'll pause on that point because
I was gonna say, yeah, the big thing I think about with all that stuff is the ability for it to augment, but then human nature to say, I'm working this hard today. This will bring me back to here. I don't want to work this hard tomorrow. I'm going to go ahead and take the easy button and do this. Like, how fast, without motivated people, and there's plenty of motivated people to keep up with that stuff and keep relations with Jim and others that have that stuff. How many though are going to shortchange the implementation of the AI as far as like the training of it and all that to make sure that it does actually have the right sources and the output is right? Or how many are then on the flip side going to just sit there and take it and say, yeah, this looks pretty good, I'm going to go with this. My day's easy. I can sit on the boat all day and push the button, George Jetson style, and like my job's done, right? Like there's not a lot that pushes people past that part. And my fear is that you get more people that they start to lose those connections with those other sources, right? Like, oh, you know what? I don't need Jim anymore. Like this does good enough.
Well, yeah, I mean, it goes back to what you said earlier, like when you're talking about news feeds. For a lot of people, news feeds are intelligence, right? And they're not necessarily going to know. Or Jim pointed out, hey, do I really want to know? Because if I know, now I can't. Now I can't deny knowing, right? So it's I think the difference is it's predicated on two things. One, I think for those organizations that have an ethos and a spirit and esprit de corps, that's really focused around integrity and quality and striving to be the best at what they do, so that whomever they sell their work product to in whatever fashion, whether it's directly or whether it's through a platform, they're not going to sacrifice on that, and they're not going to allow the work product to become some sort of homogenized, product of mediocrities, like everyone's favorite Greek philosopher, right? Good enough, right? Mediocrities. They're not going to allow that to happen because there's reputation involved still, right? This is part of the problem, I think, with this aspect of the industry, in my opinion, is that it's very easy to homogenize threat intelligence and kind of make it sound like it's an everyman thing. It's not. It's a skill. It's a very unique discipline and skill set within a very unique ecosystem of skill sets and disciplines. It's not as common, even though it's more common today than it was like when guys like you all and I started out. It's still not as common as people would like it to, believe that it is, because it's rooted and based and anchored in, a history of disciplines and lessons that have been passed down generation to generation that ultimately kind of made its way into this part of it, an industry that emerged out of computer science. So I think that for organizations that won't tolerate somebody sitting on the boat, right, pressing the button like this, it's going to be a different experience. I think also consumers will see through that. I think, I think that, again, like I said, I think there's really rational use cases and applications of artificial intelligence for a lot of what would otherwise be pedestrian, time-consuming tasks. If you were going to write, for example, a dossier, and you had all the information, you'd done all the research, you'd done all the collection, you'd done all the analysis, but you'd maybe even written a few drafts of something, but you wanted to kind of put it through an AI tool to have it editorialized, right, to meet your standards based on templates you guys have built out, so on and so forth. I think that's a wonderful aspect of the application of the tooling, because it can help expedite the creation of an already fidelity-driven and integrity-driven, bourgeois work product. And then you can kind of socialize that more for scrutiny at a peer-to-peer level, and then ultimately do what you want to do with that. I think for people who are looking at it as being just the easy button, it's gonna be a series of disappointing outcomes, because, again, broadly speaking, generative AI and LLM is trained on the internet, right? And by nature, and it's using what? Reinforcement learning, right? And that's true for the good guys, and it's also true for the bad guys. So the good guys who are kind of bolting on generative AI and LLMs to pre-existing technologies, or using it for the purposes we're talking about, are largely speaking using the same models, not always, not exclusively, but foundationally there's a lot of use of application of publicly available models as well as open source models, right? And the bad guys have access to that same modeling too. So I think the proof will be in the pudding when it comes down to the effectiveness and the quality and the accuracy of the work product time and time again, right? So I think for people who have an informed eye, CISOs and VPs of cybersecurity, chief intelligence officers, which are becoming more and more of a thing. I was one at NetWitness before I was a chief product officer. I think it's going to become a higher and higher bar that they're going to hold their vendors accountable to, because they're not going to be willing to take what they know could very well be a push of the button, right, by an entry-level person, and ultimately distilled work products that may or may not meet what they could have already trained their junior folks up to do, and to also exceed internally. So I think it's gonna present quite a lot of opportunity for vendors to up their game, and to continue to up their game. And I also think it's going to make for a great opportunity for consumers to demand higher quality, because you're right, there are going to be folks who are just hitting the button on the boat or wherever they're at.
And listen, I'd love to be optimistic with you on this, Will, and think that that's how it's going to go. But watching like the pen testing industry, some of these other industries, there are plenty of companies out there that, you know, are running fold scans, are doing fully automated, that produce pretty much garbage. And,
Sure.
you know,
Yeah.
they're existing. You're right. Like, as much as I like to think companies like the CISO's sitting here like, nope, this is garbage, I'm moving on. I don't know. I mean, I haven't seen it, but maybe that's happened. Like, that's my fear, though, is that we've seen it with other portions of it, that there's a whole bunch of button pushers that are happening. They're making tons of money because either you're friends or you're cheap or you're whatever. And, you know, they don't come back and say, well, look, I can't go afford that other one over there. Yeah, sure, it's the best one out there, but this one solves my problem, or right, like this checks the box. And I hate the check box and all that stuff, but it's a reality that this is what's happening with a lot of places. These things keep surviving because of those type of standards.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I mean, what do you think, Ralph, Jim? What do you guys think about that?
I think a lot of people, I think a lot of companies, I think a lot of people is in a very broad sense, is struggling with cybersecurity fatigue. It costs more money every day. Hey, you asked for $1 million last quarter. Now you're asking for 3, and next quarter you're asking for 9. Combine that with the seemingly endless flow of increasing number of vulnerabilities. And now you want to do, you know, to James's point, like deep dive testing where I know you're going to find something, right? But from an AI perspective, real quickly going back to something you said a little while ago that really rang true with me is and I think it's true to all AI in every aspect, is it's great to summarize, but if the foundation is weak and you build on it, you're going to get vibe code, right?
Yeah.
But if you understand what you're doing, matter of fact, James and I were having this before the show, is, you know, I remember, you know, when calculators were first being allowed used in high school kind of thing. Yep. I just aged myself. And I remember the teacher going, I was like, hey, I'm going to use this calculator. And they're like, nope, no, you're not. I'm like, why? You know, I can just do it. They go, well, if you know what it's doing, then you can use the calculator, right? So it goes back to your intelligence component. If you have a high degree of fidelity and you want to be able to summarize that so it can be consumed and acted on quickly, AI is great for that. It's a fundamental way to do it because you know the underlying framework and you have quality information you can draw from. I fear people are using it for the other way around, right?
I think, I think you're right. I think that's good, and that's going to be true in a lot of industries, not just cyber, right? I mean, I think people will naturally think that there's an easy button for this. I even the term vibe code gives me kind of like the heebie-jeebies, man. I don't like that term because it's just like, it's so anathema to what guys like. I was having a conversation yesterday with a former colleague of mine from my ISS days yesterday, and we were chatting about that. He's in the pen testing business and the code security business. And I said, you know, it's interesting to me because if you know development, you understand code development, you understand building products, and you understand all these things, it's a great force multiplier. You still have to look at all your code. You can't just trust it implicitly, but you can prototype at a pace and a cadence that was unheard of in the past. If you know what you're doing foundationally and you know the respective area of discipline that you're in, and you're going to adhere to all the things that we've been harping on for, you know, now decades, like, you know, with regards to the software development lifecycle and building security into that and all points in between. If that's the case, you're gonna outpace a lot of people. If you're just talking about, like you're saying, the easy button, where today, hey, I don't know anything about, I'll just pick a silly thing. I don't know anything about the medical industry, but I'm going to create an app for monitoring blood sugar levels in diabetic folks. I'm just going to vibe it up. Well, that's probably not going to work for you or anybody else who has the misfortune of using that application, right? So, you know, again, because it's using the internet. Go ahead.
See, you asked where my head's at, and I think that if I let you talk long enough, you'll get to where my head's at, and that was it right there. And that is AI, much like any enabling technology, automation, starting at very simple mechanical automation a million years ago, all the way to today, enables everything. It's a rise. It really is the rising tide. What that means is bad guys and good guys will get the same advantage. We are historically hamstrung by, budget and business constraints and ethics and all those silly things that the bad guys aren't.
Right.
Just like
we talk about that a lot. We call it the economics of tokenization. They don't suffer from that. You and I and the rest of us suffer from that, right?
That's right.
Bad guys don't.
And the last, and like the ugly last part of this is, as you mentioned, it enables bullshit just as well as it enables really smart thinking. So the con artists, I'm not a lawyer, but I stayed at a Holiday Inn Express last night, so I can vibe code a legal app. Like
could you imagine? Yeah,
it's gonna happen. It's gonna happen.
It's probably already happened.
It's gonna happen faster. Like is it gonna make society better or worse? The answer is yes. And just faster. And I think it's a good place to end us there. Will, I'll give you 60 seconds to give us what does the future of intelligence look like? If you look, I think as far as we can look is about 3 years. What do you think is where are we in 3 years?
Oh man, that's a great question. I think for as much as the more things change, the more things stay the same, right? So I think that smarter adversaries are going to get smarter, and they're going to apply these tools as we've already seen them do in the last 18 months to 2 years, and globally in small and larger scenarios. There's going to be because of the egalitarianism, right, and the ubiquity of these tools, you're going to have what was formerly a pretty well-known paradigm where you had very advanced threat actors and adversaries, and all the way down to miscreants. There's going to be a great equalization, across the board, which is going to be much more problematic. It might be more like what we saw in the 90s, where script kiddies were just as powerful and hazardous as a lot of more sophisticated actors were, because script kiddies back then were really more sophisticated than today's script kiddies, right? In a lot of respects. So I think it's going to become more problematic and more challenging on a lot of different fronts for defenders. But I also think it's an opportunity for a renaissance to happen within cyber defense as it relates to intelligence. I think good intelligence-driven organizations, whether they're siloed standalone intel organizations or whether they're part of a product ecosystem, are going to become better and more refined, largely speaking, the reasons we've talked about today, because they're going to be able to double down on that institutional knowledge as well as the individual knowledge, right? So it's not just a question of the collective knowledge, but the individual knowledge of their expertise, the Roths, the Jims, the Jameses, the whomevers, right? The Jens. So there's all these people out there, right, who are brilliant in what they do, right? And from an intel point of view, we'll be able to apply these technologies and ultimately speaking, lead us into a new era of what I think is going to be much more highly actionable and, dare I say, preventative applications of threat intelligence, with and without artificial intelligence. And I think that's really important, right? And the industry has really kind of been reeling for more than a decade now, in and around this idea of assumed risk and assumed breach risk, and ultimately speaking, segued into this reactive approach to things that I think good threat intelligence, especially the type we're talking about today, which is really forward thinking, and not just data, not just machine readable threat intelligence, truly broad spectrum, well-crafted intelligence work products that are meaningful to security operations teams, to CISOs, to CTI teams, of course, right, and so on and so forth, as well as even to the officer who's in charge of risk at an organization. So they better understand the relevance and the role and the importance of good, well-synthesized threat intelligence work products as a business enabler, as opposed to something that's just largely speaking buried in the bowels of the SecOps ecosystem. It manifests once in a while within the SOC that somebody talks about in a presentation at some point in time that they really don't have any understanding of unless they see a news feed. Hey,
yeah, that's fair.
Was it tied to those Panda guys, or was it tied to those Rocket Kitten guys? Is that what James was talking about?
Yeah,
right?
That's fair.
But, yeah.
All right. That's it. That's a good place to wrap this, guys. Will, thanks for your expertise. This is always enlightening to have you on, buddy. we'll see where this industry goes. I think, like I said, I think this is just a rising tide.
Yeah.
Some people will choose to float their boat higher. Some people will choose to tread water, and some will refuse. And that's just how it's going to be.
Yeah, my pleasure, guys.
So,
thanks for having me. It's always a blast hanging out with you guys.
All right. Well, thanks for listening, you guys. Thanks for being a guest on the podcast here, Will. And for everybody that's out there, thanks for joining us on yet another Down the Security Rabbit Hole podcast. Look forward to having you next time. We'll see you later. Take care. Bye-bye.